In order to bring the conference to a thoughtful conclusion, we couldn't imagine a better way to invite you to Boston than to show you one of the leading lights in Boston and hear from her. Our closing keynote speaker is Diane Paulus. Diane is the artistic director of ART. She has incredible credits across so many art forms. In theater, anyone who has seen her production of Hair on Broadway with 8 Tony nominations will know what a great theater director she is. She, as she revealed earlier, is a great proponent of the works of Shakespeare, but in opera has directed the late Mozart operas, opera by Monteverdi, and is doing some other operatic work, notably the world premiere production of Todd Mackover's piece Death and the Powers, which premieres in Monaco this September and then at Chicago Opera Theater in the spring of 2011. So Diane is busy directing. She's also very busy teaching and has taught at Columbia, at Yale, and now at Harvard. She has been a frequent panelist for Opera America, a member of our grant-making juries, and is a constant good friend. So without any further ado, please welcome our closing keynote speaker, Diane Paulus.
Thank you. I am honored to be here and to speak to you all and to invite you to Boston. Before I get to that invitation, I just wanted to say a little bit about my thoughts on how lucky I feel to be working in the opera. And I have to say, I left the panel this morning very galvanized about the revolution we will all make in the opera, and I hope to speak to that in this next 10 to 15 minutes. I think more than anything, we often think about opera and perhaps the baggage that is associated with it, this concern of, do we call it opera? What is opera? Does opera feel inclusive enough? Is there a future for the opera? Where is the audience for opera? Can opera be popular? All these questions. And I have to return today to point to the potential of opera, and that being, I'm sure, why all of us sit in this very room. And when I say potential, I can speak to you in terms of a director's point of view. I feel the chief job of a director is to have a nose for potential, and that is what we do. We are looking for some possible creation that needs to be released. We don't necessarily know how we're going to get there. We don't know how we're going to do it. We don't know the answers, but we must have the sense of that potential, and our job as a director is to point to the top of the mountain and keep everyone climbing when everyone gets tired. You know, you have to sort of know where you're going, not necessarily how you're going to get there, but you have to have that guiding spirit to get everyone to climb that mountain. And I feel more than any other art form, opera has that incredible potential. And I speak about opera because I do work in the theater. And ever since I was a little girl, I grew up in New York City, and I basically lived on 66th and West End Avenue, so I played in Lincoln Center as a child. Damrosch Park was sort of my playground, and I'd play on the fountains in Lincoln Center. And it was a very impressionable moment, and I think if those of you heard James Conlon speak about what it means to impress young people, being in that complex, being around those buildings, being taken to the ballet and the Philharmonic and the opera, and then having a mother who was not at all involved in the arts formally say to me as a young child, opera is the ultimate art form. And I have to say, I carry that with me to this day. And all my life growing up in the theater, not really having worked in opera, I knew I wanted to be in the opera. So there is something about the opera for me, and I think it has to do with the sense of event, which I want to speak about. I came to Boston in the last 2 years to take over the American Repertory Theater. And we are a 30-year-old regional theater, very well known for doing avant-garde cutting-edge work that's toured all over the world. We've also premiered operas. We did the premiere of Philip Glass's Orphée. We did a production of Orlando that Peter Sellers directed back in the 1980s. So we float between theater and opera, so we are actively questioning and blurring those lines of what is theater, what is music theater, what is opera. When I came to the theater, I have to tell you, we were not doing well. This was 2 years ago. And I looked at this model, and I think this can relate to anyone thinking about what it is to run an arts institution. We had lost our subscriptions. We had lost audience. Perhaps we were down to maybe 40% ticket sales overall as an average. And when I was asked to consider taking on the job of running the theater, I thought, my God, if the ART, which is housed in Cambridge and Boston, which is an urban center, which is in the backyard and affiliated with Harvard University, and is in Boston, which is a city with more colleges than any other city in America, with an interested intellectual audience, if that theater can't be thriving and filled with people every single night, then that is not just a problem for the ART, that's truly a problem for the American theater, and something is wrong with the model. So I actually kind of took off my hat as a freelance director and agreed to run the institution, and I was specifically hired to run the theater not only as artistic director, but as the CEO and the manager of all the finances of the theater. And this was something I was very interested in doing, thinking very emphatically that for the theater and the arts to be viable in the 21st century, we have to think of the two arts and business sides of the equations equally, and they have to be intertwined. We cannot have the arts happening on one side and then the business or marketing people on the other side, and them trying to help each other, but when it doesn't go well, they kind of can point the finger at each other. So my whole point of being at the ART is to bring the two together and to think about audience. The way I've learned to think about audience at the ART is very clearly stemming from the realization that it is very hard to get an audience out to the theater. And I start with that premise. I don't start with the premise that audience should come to the theater or that people should want to have art in their life, but rather how can I make the theater and an arts experience necessary for someone? How can I appeal to an audience and say, yes, it's an extremely generous act to give up several hours of your life to come out to a live artistic event, and this is why you should, which means to me, it has to feel like an event. It has to feel like a must-see, I can't miss this kind of a happening, which was also brought up in our panel this morning, in order to really rally audience to come out and see what you are making or cooking. For me, the opera has potential here because actually what we might look at as a limitation in the opera field, which is very few performances, I would actually put on the table as something we should embrace and celebrate. If you work in the theater and if you look at kind of the trajectory of theater, really within the theater, your goal is to get to Broadway, and what happens on Broadway? You have to run a show for as long as you possibly can, and that equals success. And there's a lot of energy spent in what can sustain audience over years. How can you market a show and develop an audience and keep it coming week after week after week? Which to me, in many ways, takes away from the powerful event of that operatic, it only is going to happen 5 or 6 times or a handful of times over several months. You can't miss it. It's a once-in-a-lifetime shot. You've got to get there. You've got to, therefore, buy your ticket in advance and make sure you get that seat because it's not going to be around for so long. So I think about the event of opera as something that we should focus on and embrace as much as possible. I also think that creating an event is not just marketing, and I just want to say very clearly that the idea that thinking about audience, thinking about what an audience might want to say, I've got to get there to see it, is not necessarily just what the marketing department does. I think I've come of age in the theater. I was the great beneficiary of seeing subsidized work in the 60s, 70s, 80s. But when I came to my professional career in the 90s, there was no such thing as a young director that you thought your work would be subsidized or supported by the government. You really got out of grad school and you thought, I have to figure out how to be an entrepreneur. I have to figure out how to make work that people will want to meet me halfway on, see, get the butts in the seats. And this is part of what I do as a director, as a creative person. So I am very interested now, leading an arts institution, in training and speaking to directors and artists, designers, and let's take that to the next chain of the discussion, to performers, and say we all must think entrepreneurial. We all must think about how we can make this viable and sellable in the best possible way, that making something appeal to an audience doesn't mean it has to be pandered or pander to an audience or lowered or dumbed down in any way, but simply to have those ideas thinking just the way the great playwrights of all time, Molière and Shakespeare, to just name two, were not just playwrights. They were entrepreneurs. They ran theater companies. They were general directors. They were producers and the playwright, and often actors as well. We tend to think, I think, in a modern age in the theater of things very segmented, but I'm a great proponent of putting together all these different pieces of the pie so that we train our young artists and our young directors and designers to think financially, to think creatively, to think about audience in a very powerful way. And that leads to the last piece of the equation for me, which is giving the audience a voice in the happening. Now, what that means, there was a very interesting study done at MIT that a colleague told me about. They asked the student body at MIT why they don't attend arts events more frequently. And MIT is known as a science school, but they do have a very active arts program. And there were two takeaways from that. One was students said it took too much time, which we can speak to in a moment. And they said, I'm not engaged. My presence doesn't feel necessary. And I've thought about that a lot over the last year because it's so specific. I actually think the issue of duration is perhaps misleading because I believe it's not simply that going to the theater or the opera takes too much time. It's that we don't question what the duration should be or is necessarily merited for. You can have an operatic work that is 15 hours long, or you can have an operatic work that's 60 minutes. In the theater, we tend to think formulaically, 2.5 hours makes a good theater show. Why do we do that? There is something, as we all know, about the mania of seeing marathon experiences like The Ring, which is confirmation that audiences will come out for long duration events. In fact, in the theater, events like Coast of Utopia and Angels in America and the Tantalus Project in Denver, these are shows that people like to attend because it actually requires them to sort of put on their backpack and pack their trail mix and do those theater experiences, just the way you do The Ring, and you cannot be passive. And I was speaking to my friend who plays in the orchestra of The Ring here in Los Angeles, and he said they've gotten more, after 5 hours, they've gotten more curtain calls at 5 hours than they do in a shorter length piece. And why is that? I'm sure it's not only because of the great artistry, but because you are there and you've completed that experience and you've stuck it out and you want to stand up and make yourself present and say, I was here and I applaud you. And to me, that is as much what it means to be at the theater, to be present, to be there, to know that you have an impact, that you have a voice. The other piece about being engaged, again, I think, has to do with a very sad possibility that students feel more engaged with their laptops than they do at a live theater event. And that's not to say that laptops can't be engaging, but I think too often we make a big deal about how we are a live event and we don't actually allow that liveness to have an expression. So more often than not, audiences come to a live event and they're permitted to fall asleep, and that's the accepted behavior. And if you're not connected or you're not engaged, you're checking out. So I think this idea of how can we make the presentness, the liveness, the power of what we do, which is what we're all addicted to, how can we make that and push that to the forefront of our audiences so that we won't allow a young person to come to the opera and have the opportunity to just say, well, I don't get it or I don't understand it, and so I can fall asleep or go into my brain and not actually deal with what's on stage. And I have to say, I know I spoke with James Conlon about this after our panel, that being in the theater, I always talk about the opera because I'm on a crusade to change theatrical audience etiquette. I believe we've been too beaten down into thinking that if we have an opinion, if we would dare to speak to the actors or perhaps express our likes or dislike, we'd be asked to leave, which is probably true at most theaters, that if you are at all disruptive, you'll be taken out of the premises. And I always talk about how great opera audiences are because they actually care enough because they will boo at something if they don't like it. And James said to me, well, some of them come just to boo. But when I was a young assistant working with André Serban in France, he was doing Massenet's Thais, and I was sitting in the opera house, and it was the end of the first act, and someone from the top ring screamed down to the orchestra level saying, you know, mettre en scène aux toilettes. And then someone screamed back up saying, shut up, you haven't even seen the show yet, be quiet. And this dialogue went back and forth, and then, then it stopped, and then they went into the interlude and went into the next act. And I went backstage, and the French stage manager was mortified and embarrassed and said, oh, how terrible they behave this way. And I said, I think it's great that people would care enough, like they do at sporting events. Again, I always look to that sporting event audience that, will care enough that they will scream at the coach or scream at the referee or scream at the team to say, you're not playing well enough. And I on a extreme continuum, would rather an audience get on our case and say we're not doing well enough than to have them fall asleep. So I do also think about opera that has that kind of Olympic sport-like athletic event quality to it, and again, hope that we can embrace this aspect of the form as we move forward. To speak about Boston now, on behalf of Boston Lyric and Opera Boston, I want to really invite you to a thrilling conference that is being planned in 2011 for Boston. And there are two themes that are emerging that I'll just tantalize you with. The first is entrepreneurship. And I just wanted to give you some statistics about Boston and some facts. Boston is a unique major metropolitan community in that it has no true opera house or performing arts center. Boston, and by extension Cambridge, also has the highest percentage of academic institutions per capita, and many of these institutions have very strong music programs. Perhaps as a result of these two factors, no opera house and lots of opera stakeholders, this is why there is a tremendous amount of opera supply in Boston and in the surrounding area. Many artists come out of universities and conservatories with the desire to produce opera and music theater in non-traditional ways, some by design, some by circumstance, in order to thrive in a competitive entertainment market that includes one of the greatest orchestras in the country and is only a short train ride away from the center of North American activity, opera activity, every opera impresario in the Boston community, from the smallest company to the two largest professional producers, must think entrepreneurially. And not coincidentally, after Silicon Valley, Boston is home to the largest number of startup companies in the United States, and the city's largest music conservatory even has a degree program in entrepreneurial musicianship. So this will be a theme for our conference. How can we think entrepreneurially, not only as producers, as artists, and as students and performers entering the field? The other theme that I'd like to speak to, which I'm very excited to be participating in Boston, is partnerships across arts institutions. And this has been a big theme of mine coming to Boston. I think Boston is small enough, frankly, that this can actually be achieved. And it's been a mission of mine coming to Boston to finally crack this open and not think about every arts institution having a piece of the pie that we have to guard like this and get paranoid about sharing, but rather thinking maybe there's another way of reaching out across the table and becoming stronger across institutions than we can be in our own corner. It's a crass analogy, but the idea that you can't have a Burger King on the same block as a McDonald's, we know has been proven wrong. That actually the fact that people come to the McDonald's means the Burger King will get more business. You can have two shops selling the same thing on the same block. And there's got to be a way, certainly in these economic times, that we can think forward in a different kind of way across partnerships with other institutions. The two that I'll speak to specifically that you'll have a chance to learn more about, I am working on an opera piece, which I think is an extraordinary example of partnership. It is with the MIT Media Lab. This is Todd Mackover's Death and the Powers that Marc mentioned. So this is an opera that is being produced in collaboration with the Media Lab and the ART as a theatrical organization, with MIT, the university, and Harvard University. We are also in partnership with Opera Boston, and we'll be presenting the work at the Cutler Majestic. So this is part of the American Repertory Theater subscription season next year. It is not in our building. It is not where our audience tends to go for ART events. It's across the river at an opera venue, which is the Cutler Majestic. And we are partnering across universities. Even the fact that MIT and Harvard are collaborating on this is kind of a big deal in our town. This is an opera that uses state-of-the-art technology that has been designed and developed out of the MIT Media Lab. It also is pointing to the fact that the highest levels of scientific invention and technology, rather than feeling like they're the death of culture, are actually very akin to the artistic process and very allied with what we do in the arts, which is to delve into the unknown and try to reach to something that is not imagined yet in our world. So it's not only an artistic institutional partnership, but an art and science partnership. And the other partnership, of course, is with the ART. And I do encourage, I might be the only person here at the conference that runs a theatrical regional theater, but I hope that will change over the years and that there'll be more theaters that will join this idea that theaters can be partners. I was in London 2 years ago working at the Young Vic, which is a small 600-seat theater, and we partnered with the ENO when we did a new opera by Olga Neuwirth, Lost Highway. It was a partnership that was the first kind of partnership in London across a theatrical venue and a major opera company. And what I would like to offer to you is for you to think as perhaps a model with the ART, how theaters can partner with opera organizations to diversify audience, to allow different projects. I've heard all too often that certain opera companies are just stuck with what they have to deal with, which is a giant opera house. Can there be partners in your city that can allow you to develop work, that can allow you to diversify and do opera in lesser capacity venues in a way that makes financial sense, to take your work out of your building through a partnership with a theater? And at ART, we've taken our second stage and actually converted it into a nightclub in an effort to create a new revenue stream and create a new center of nightlife, which I believe is part of the power of theater. And I'm looking forward to, as part of the conference, building an evening with all those little opera companies that exist in Boston, where they'll create event opera at the nightclub at our venue in Harvard Square called O.B.E. So I hope to see you in Boston. I thank you for your time and listening today, and I look forward to, as I said earlier, making the revolution happen and making American opera and opera in America something that we should all say is the coolest thing that we should ever be doing. Thank you.
So I add my thanks to you for coming here to Los Angeles, and I encourage you to be with us in Boston again, and I'll turn to our chairman, Anthony Freud, for the final words.
Of course, the one person who Marc didn't thank, I'm going to start by thanking, and that is Marc himself. You all know by now that this is Marc's 20th anniversary as President and CEO of Opera America. We have paid as fulsome and as regular tributes as he would allow. And frankly, he's a very, very hard person to compliment. His team is extraordinary, and his team is a tribute to him. He's a wonderful, inspirational leader, and Marc, I know just how much hard work it takes to organize a conference as electrifying and stimulating and fulfilling as the last 3 days have been. And let me add my thanks to you and to the whole of the Opera America team. Thank you to you all. Trying to sum up the impact of a conference like this in a few moments is about as challenging as it is to pay tribute to Marc Scorca in a few sentences. I've had the best time, I have to say. I love trying to find ways of making connections from one session to the next. Wasn't it interesting that one of the first things we heard at the opening session keynote speech from Daniel Catan was his desire that we create some sort of national cultural conversation that presented a real challenge to us, and this is the perfect environment to try to stimulate it. But then hearing today about the importance of social networking technology, how people are tweeting during performances of Götterdämmerung, perhaps it's through Twitters, through Facebook, that we can really find a way of driving the engine of a national cultural conversation. How can one not enjoy the sort of day that I had yesterday? I started at the session that included Danielle on great challenging form, then it was straight to David McIntosh and new business modeling, then to Placido Domingo, to co-production speed dating, and to new work sampler. What a day that was, that I must say I found absolutely thrilling. Even lunchtime yesterday was particularly stimulating, and not just for the conversations. Nicholas Payne and I were standing in rather a long line at the wonderful Mendocino Farms sandwich market that I'm sure you've all discovered, that offers a bewildering array of choices in devastatingly small print. And we discovered the existence of a boneless rib sandwich. And maybe it's because neither of us were born in the US, but the concept of a boneless rib struck us as very stimulating. And later in the afternoon, I managed to find 10 minutes to wander around the Gorky exhibition before the new work sampler. And wandering around it, it seemed to me, wouldn't it be a wonderful doctoral thesis to explore the relationship between the boneless rib and abstract expressionism? I think David McIntosh would have made good use of the boneless rib in his presentation about new business models. How can anyone go to that session and not emerge really working to explore how we can do better for our businesses? I started thinking about variations on what to me was his most memorable metaphor. Instead of cutting them, if one encourages bushes to grow, maybe the trees will grow even higher. And as you know, we're very keen on our bushes in Texas. To those of you who were not at David McIntosh's session, you won't have a clue what I'm talking about. And I have absolutely no intention of explaining it to you. Just ask around. I also am fascinated by exploring the contradictions that one encounters in conferences like this. It isn't all about answering questions. In fact, it's much more, in my mind, about asking questions than answering them. Like the best productions of the best operas, we want to pose questions. We want to make our audiences think. One wonderful example this morning was to hear John Conklin talk about how important it was to try and minimize ritual from the experience of opera going. And not 45 minutes ago, I was delighted to hear Francesca Zambello talk about the importance of including ritual in the experience of opera going. And the wonderful thing is that they're both right. And what is so fascinating about these conferences is our ability to emerge from the conference enriched, provoked, stimulated, able to do better jobs for the organizations that we work for. Two particular moments of what James Conlon said this morning struck me very deeply. One was his reference to the danger of the generic. And that's something that I think Opera America cannot talk about too often. While we are an association that exists to promote collaboration, to promote best practice, to promote conversations between our members, we are absolutely not in existence to try to persuade our members to standardize anything. We are absolutely conscious of the fact that of all organizations, artistic organizations absolutely have to pride themselves in their individual identities, their individual personalities, and their responsibilities to their individual cities. And the avoidance and the danger of the generic is something that I hope you as members of Opera America absolutely understand is at the core of our mission. The other thing that I found very powerful was a repeated reference that James made to the need to reach the essence of a piece. And I suspect we could have a whole 3-day conference to discuss what the essence of a piece actually might be. Reaching the essence of everything we do is absolutely at the heart of what I believe is our core responsibility to our organizations and to our art form. I'm constantly on the search for quotations from people who can express things much more precisely than I can, that I feel are useful and that somehow do help me reach the essence of why we exist as creative opera companies. And I want to share with you 2 very brief quotes that I came across a few weeks ago wandering around one Saturday morning, the Art Gallery of Ontario. If any of you are in Toronto, it is the most extraordinary gallery to spend time in. It's really, truly wonderful. One quote is from a professor of psychoanalysis from the 1960s called Donald W. Winnicott. And it's basically his explanation rather than definition of creativity. What he says is, creativity is the doing that arises out of being. It indicates that he or she who is alive. Creativity is the ability to create the world. On the basis of the sense of having created the world is everything that is meaningful. It is crucial to the ability to make life feel meaningful and worth living. The second quote is very much briefer. It's one sentence. Simon Sharma is a brilliant art historian, writer, broadcaster, and I came across, also in the Art Gallery of Toronto, this one-sentence definition of art, which struck me as extremely poignant and precise. He says that art is mystery and matter delivered in a rush of poetic illumination. Perfect, I think. The final thanks I want to offer are to you. However hard a host company or Opera America itself works to organize a conference like this, ultimately the conference is only as good as its delegates. I was very conscious and appreciative of the fact that really from the opening session onwards, there seemed to be an energy, a buzz, an enthusiasm around this hotel that has lasted all the way to this closing session. Opera America is only as worthwhile and as effective as its members, and Opera America annual conferences are only as exciting and fulfilling as those who come make it. So on behalf of everybody at Opera America, let me say thank you to you for your presence, for your participation, and for your enthusiasm. I want to wish you all the best of years, and I look forward to seeing you all a year from now in Boston. Thank you all very much.